My name is Aisha. And for a long time, in that building, my name didn't matter. They didn't bother to learn it. They didn't bother to pronounce it. Most days, they didn't even bother to look at my face. To them, I was just the intern. The girl with the cheap badge. The girl sent for coffee. The girl who sat quietly in the corner while powerful men talked about money, control, and futures they assumed they owned. They laughed when I walked past. They joked when I spoke up. They mocked my silence and mistook it for weakness. What they didn't know, what they never once thought to check, was who I really was. I wasn't there to learn. I wasn't there to impress anyone. And I definitely wasn't there by accident. I was watching. Every email they assumed no one read. Every file they thought no one would open. Every lie told confidently in rooms where they believed power made them untouchable. I let them underestimate me. Because underestimation is the greatest advantage of all. They thought they were training an intern. In reality, they were exposing themselves to someone who legally had the right to end everything they'd built. This is the story of how they mocked me, how they tried to erase me, and how, in the end, I called the shareholder meeting. That ended his career. The first thing they noticed was the badge. Not my face. Not the way I stood straight even when my hands were shaking slightly. Not the fact that I arrived 10 minutes early and waited quietly near the glass doors while the city woke up around me. Just the badge. Cheap plastic. Black letters. One word that erased everything else about me. Intern. That word followed me the moment I stepped into the building. Conversations softened. Eyes flicked downward, scanning my chest before deciding I wasn't worth their time. People in tailored suits walked past me as if I were part of the furniture. Useful, replaceable, invisible. I paused briefly in the lobby, letting it sink in. This place was built to intimidate. Marble floors polished to perfection, glass walls reflecting confidence, power humming quietly in every corner. People moved with purpose here. Or at least, they looked like they did. I took a breath and walked toward the reception desk. The woman behind it didn't smile. She barely looked up. "Intern?" she asked, already reaching for a temporary card. "Yes." "Orientation. 14th floor." That was the entire conversation. In the elevator, I stood surrounded by people who smelled like expensive cologne and certainty. Their conversations were loud, careless, talk of deals, bonuses, weekend plans. One of them glanced at my badge and smirked. "They really let anyone in these days," he said to his colleague. They laughed. I kept my eyes on the floor numbers as they climbed. Each one felt like a reminder of where power lived, and where it didn't. The orientation room was smaller, tucked away like an afterthought. A group of interns sat around a long table, already comparing achievements, connections, expectations. No one asked me anything. No one needed to. Then the door opened, and the room changed. He walked in like he owned the air. Confident. Polished. Untouchable. The kind of man who never questioned whether he belonged in a room, because everyone else already assumed he did. "You're here because you think you're special," he said calmly. "Let me correct that." Nervous laughter followed. "This company doesn't care about your feelings. It cares about results. If you're useful, you stay. If not, you disappear." His eyes moved slowly across the room and stopped on me for a moment. "What's your background?" he asked. "Business and data analysis." He smiled faintly. Not impressed. Ambitious for an intern. The room laughed. I didn't. When assignments were handed out, excitement filled the room until my turn came. "Records and administrative support," he said. "Basement level." The word basement landed exactly how he intended it to. Someone whispered, "That's where they send people they don't care about." He shrugged. "Someone has to do it." I nodded politely. Understood. That was when I realized something important. They weren't trying to help me succeed. They were testing how much disrespect I would tolerate. The basement was cold and dim, lined with old filing cabinets and outdated computers. Dust clung to corners no one bothered to clean anymore. This wasn't where careers were built. It was where they were forgotten. I set my bag down and got to work. At first, it was mindless, scanning, sorting, entering data. Exactly what they expected. But the longer I worked, the more I noticed small things that didn't quite make sense. Numbers that didn't add up. Vendors that appeared too often. Approvals that skipped steps. I didn't react. I didn't ask questions. I watched. Upstairs, the joke started almost immediately. Hey, intern, coffee. Intern, make yourself useful. Don't worry, she won't be here long. Once, during a meeting I wasn't meant to speak in, the man laughed and said, if she messes it up, it doesn't matter. She's temporary. Everyone laughed. I smiled politely. Inside, I remembered every word. Late one evening, while delivering files to the executive floor, I stopped walking. A large portrait hung near the boardroom. The founder. The man whose vision built everything around me. His eyes in the photo were calm, steady, nothing like the culture that now carried his name. They had forgotten him. They had forgotten what this place was meant to be. They had forgotten who they were dealing with. I stood there longer than I should have, then walked away without a word. That night, as I left the building and stepped back into the noise of the city, one truth settled clearly in my mind. They didn't see me. And that was exactly how I wanted it. They made it clear early on that I was expected to stay quiet. Not officially. No one ever said it directly. But silence was one of the unwritten rules of the building, and people like me were expected to follow it without question. I learned that in small ways at first. How conversations stopped when I approached, how emails went unanswered, how my name was always added at the very end of a task list, if it appeared at all. Every morning, I arrived early. Not because anyone asked me to, but because being present before everyone else gave me a few minutes of calm before the day began. In those quiet moments, the building felt different. Less arrogant. Almost honest. That feeling never lasted. By the time the offices filled, I faded back into the background. People passed by my desk without acknowledging me. Some didn't bother to lower their voices when talking about me. She's too serious for an intern, one woman said near the copier. Doesn't talk much, someone else replied. Probably doesn't know much either. I heard everything. The first time I spoke up in a meeting, it wasn't intentional. I was standing near the wall, taking notes, when I noticed a document being discussed was missing an entire section. Without thinking, I said quietly, "There's a page missing." The room went still. He turned slowly, as if offended by the sound of my voice. "Did I ask for input?" he said calmly. "No," I replied. "I just thought." "Thought?" He smiled. "That's not your job." A few people laughed. Not because it was funny, but because laughing felt safer than staying silent. I nodded and wrote something in my notebook, not the notes I was supposed to be taking, but the way people reacted. Who laughed? Who looked uncomfortable? Who said nothing at all? Humiliation here wasn't loud. It was casual. Routine. Served in small, daily doses that made people doubt themselves. Tasks began appearing on my desk without explanation. Redo this. Fix that. No context. No credit. When something went wrong, it was my fault. When something went right, no one mentioned it. Once, I stayed late reformatting a report that had been handed to me in pieces. The next morning, he presented it to the board as his own. I stood in the corner while they praised him for clarity and precision. No one looked at me. At lunch, I ate alone. Not because I preferred it, but because no one invited me to sit with them. People avoided being associated with interns, especially interns who attracted the wrong kind of attention. The kind that came from asking questions. In the basement, where I worked most of the time, people spoke freely. They assumed no one down there mattered enough to understand or remember what they said. "That approval shouldn't have gone through," one man muttered once. "It did," another replied. "Don't worry. He signed off on it." I pretended not to hear. But I did. I began noticing patterns. The same vendor names. The same rushed approvals. The same people involved every time. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't take copies. Not yet. One evening, he appeared at the basement door unexpectedly. "You've been spending a lot of time down here," he said. "This is where my work is," I replied. He watched me for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Don't dig too deep. Old files have a way of confusing people." "I understand them," I said. That was the wrong answer. From that moment on, things changed. My workload increased, but my access didn't. I was asked to do more with less information. Deadlines tightened. Instructions became vague. It felt less like work and more like a test. They were waiting for me to fail. During a department meeting later that week, he presented projections that didn't align with what I'd seen in the archives. I hesitated, then raised my hand. "I think those numbers assume full regulatory approval," I said carefully. "But last year's filings." He laughed. Actually laughed. "This," he said, gesturing toward me, "is why interns don't speak." The room followed his lead. I felt heat rise to my face, but I kept my expression neutral. I nodded once and lowered my hand. "I understand." But something shifted after that. I started being watched. Emails stopped coming. My access slowed. People avoided eye contact even more than before. The silence around me felt heavier, sharper. That night, alone at home, I opened my laptop and wrote down everything I remembered. Dates, names, conversations, numbers that didn't make sense. Not because I knew what I was going to do yet, but because I knew one thing for certain. They thought they were teaching me my place. What they were really doing was showing me exactly how power was abused, quietly, confidently, and in plain sight. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. The basement became my classroom. No one ever said it out loud, but everyone treated that space as if it were beneath notice, beneath curiosity, beneath consequence. People dumped work there the way they dumped secrets, assuming no one would ever bother to look closely. That assumption became my advantage. I learned the rhythms of the place quickly. Which managers arrived early? Which ones stayed late? Which files were touched often and which had been gathering dust for years? Patterns started to emerge, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Certain vendors appeared far too frequently for a company of this size. Their contracts were always urgent, always approved at the last possible moment. Reviews were skipped. Oversight was temporarily waived. Each exception alone could be explained away. Together, they formed something deliberate. I didn't react. I didn't confront anyone. I kept doing exactly what they expected, scanning, sorting, entering data, while quietly building a mental map of how everything fit together. The more I noticed, the more careful I became. People assumed interns didn't understand nuance. They were wrong. I listened to conversations that weren't meant for me. Not because people invited me in, but because they forgot I existed. One afternoon, two managers stood near the copier arguing in low voices. "Compliance won't catch this," one said. "They never do," the other replied. "Not when he's involved." They walked away without noticing me. I kept typing. That was the day I stopped doubting myself. Late one evening, while going through archived emails tied to old financial summaries, I found something that made my fingers pause over the keyboard. A consulting firm's name appeared repeatedly, paid millions over several years for strategic advisory services. I searched for them online. Nothing. No website. No public filings. No employees. Just a name that existed only inside company records. I dug deeper. Addresses led to mailboxes. Phone numbers redirected endlessly. The firm was a ghost, present on paper, absent everywhere else. This wasn't negligence. It was design. I began copying files carefully, saving them in ways that wouldn't raise alarms. Not everything. Only what mattered. Only what connected. The work slowed me down, but I didn't mind. Moving slowly meant staying invisible. That didn't last. One night, as I was packing up to leave, I noticed someone standing in the doorway. He didn't say anything at first. Just watched. "You work late," he said finally. "This is where my desk is," I replied. He stepped closer, scanning the piles of folders. You should be careful with old records. Context matters. I understand context, I said. He smiled, but there was no humor in it. Curiosity doesn't always end well. After that, my access began disappearing. Folders that were open one day became restricted the next. Systems logged me out without explanation. Tasks came without the files needed to complete them. They weren't stopping me. They were testing me. I adapted. I memoized file structures. Took handwritten notes. Paid attention to how people reacted when certain topics came up. Fear left fingerprints everywhere once you knew how to look for them. A junior analyst approached me quietly one afternoon. "You should slow down," he whispered. "People are talking." "About what?" I asked. "You." That night, I found the email. It was buried deep in an archived thread, marked confidential. A risk assessment outlining what would happen if a major expansion failed. Environmental penalties. Legal exposure. Shutdown scenarios. Below it was a reply. "Proceed anyway. By the time this collapses, we'll be gone." I read it twice. Then a third time. This wasn't carelessness. It was intent. I didn't forward it. I didn't print it. I closed the file and saved a copy where no one would think to look. On my way out, I passed the founder's portrait again. I stopped longer this time. I finally understood something I'd been feeling since my first day. This place wasn't broken. It was rotting. And rot spreads quietly, until someone exposes it to the light. That night, I didn't sleep much. I sat at my table, writing timelines, connecting names, rehearsing possibilities I wasn't ready to act on yet. Because timing mattered. Power didn't fear truth. It feared exposure. And I was getting closer to both. By the next week, I was no longer invisible. It started with small things. A meeting moved without notice. An access card that suddenly failed at the turnstile. A task reassigned due to restructuring. Each change came wrapped in polite language, but together they sent a clear message: I was being watched. People stopped talking when I walked into rooms. Smiles became tight, professional, temporary. The easy cruelty from before was gone, replaced by something colder. Caution. One morning, an email appeared in my inbox requesting a review of my performance. No context. No specifics. Just a calendar invite and a conference room number I'd never been in before. The room was glass on 3 sides. They wanted me visible. 2 managers sat across from me, folders neatly aligned, expressions already decided. They spoke in rehearsed tones, about fit, about expectations, about how some interns struggled to understand boundaries. "Your role is support," one of them said. "Not analysis." "I've only completed assigned tasks," I replied. The other smiled thinly. "Initiative can be misinterpreted." I nodded, thanked them, and left without arguing. Arguing would have confirmed their suspicion that I thought I belonged at the table. I didn't. Not yet. After that, the work dried up. Days passed with nothing to do but sit and wait. They wanted boredom to do what confrontation couldn't, push me out quietly. Instead, it gave me time. Time to watch who avoided eye contact. Time to note which conversations stopped when I came near. Time to see how fear rearranged the office. One afternoon, a courier arrived with a box marked confidential. It sat unattended near reception for over an hour. No one wanted responsibility for it. I did. Inside were draft agreements tied to the expansion project, unsigned, unapproved, but already funded. Dates didn't line up. Authorizations skipped levels that couldn't legally be skipped. Someone was rushing. That evening, as I was scanning the last document, my screen went dark. "System maintenance," a message read. But the lights were still on. A shadow moved behind me. "You don't need to be here anymore," a voice said. I turned slowly. He stood too close, too confident for someone with nothing to hide. "Your internship ends Friday," he continued. "Early. Congratulations." "That's not what my contract says." He shrugged. "Things change." I packed my bag calmly, but my pulse was loud in my ears. If they thought cutting me off would erase what I'd already seen, they were wrong. What they didn't know was that the most important work was already done. The documents. The emails. The patterns. They were no longer just observations. They were evidence. Friday came. I handed in my badge. No one made eye contact. No exit interview. No goodbye. They thought the story ended there. It didn't. The following Monday, I sat at my kitchen table and drafted a timeline. Every decision. Every shortcut. Every name connected to a signature they hoped no one would ever question. I didn't send it. Not yet. Because I had learned something crucial inside those walls. They didn't fear losing money. They feared losing control. And control could only be challenged in one place. At the top. Leaving the building didn't end my access. It only changed how I used it. From the outside, I became invisible again, and this time, that was by choice. The first thing I did was slow everything down. No emails. No calls. No sudden moves. People who panic reveal themselves, but people who feel safe make mistakes. I wanted them comfortable. I reviewed everything I'd taken, this time without the pressure of time or eyes over my shoulder. Patterns that were hard to see inside the office became obvious from a distance. Payments routed through shell entities. Projects approved without environmental clearance. Internal risk reports deliberately buried under layers of non-critical documentation. Most revealing of all was how often the same three names appeared together. Different departments. Different signatures. Same outcomes. It wasn't a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It was worse. It was routine. I began mapping connections, who reported to whom, who benefited from which decision, who always seemed to be absent when accountability was required. Every system has pressure points. Every organization has a place where things only work because no one dares question them. I found it. The company's shareholder structure was intentionally opaque. Most shares were dispersed, held by quiet investors who trusted quarterly reports and didn't ask questions. But a handful of voting blocks, small in number, massive in influence, controlled everything. And those blocks relied on one thing above all else. Information as it was presented to them. I didn't approach regulators. Not yet. That would have triggered defenses, legal teams, rehearsed denials. I needed truth to meet power directly, without filters. I needed the shareholders. I spent weeks preparing. Not a dramatic presentation. Not accusations. Just facts arranged so clearly that denial would be impossible. Dates. Amounts. Approvals. Consequences. Every claim tied to a document. Every document tied to a signature. I rehearsed how it would sound if challenged. How it would look if dismissed. How it would survive scrutiny from people who made decisions worth millions before lunch. When I was ready, I did something they never imagined I could do. I invoked a clause buried deep in the company's governance documents, one that allowed any qualifying stakeholder to request an extraordinary shareholder meeting under specific risk conditions. They had written it themselves. Years ago. To protect the company from threats they never thought would come from someone like me. The request was formal. Polite. Legally flawless. It landed in inboxes on a quiet Tuesday morning. By Wednesday, panic had started to ripple. Phone calls went unanswered. Assistants asked for clarification. Lawyers requested delays. None were granted. The meeting was scheduled. I wasn't invited as a guest. I was listed as the requesting party. The night before the meeting, I received my first direct message from him. It wasn't threatening. It was almost friendly. He suggested we talk. Privately. Clear up misunderstandings. He even implied opportunities, consulting roles, recommendations, a future if I was reasonable. I read it once. Then I archived it. Because I knew something he didn't. This wasn't personal anymore. It was procedural. And procedures, once activated, don't care about power or reputation. They only care about what's on record. The morning of the shareholder meeting, I walked into a room I was never meant to enter. Not as an intern, not as staff, not as background. as the person who had forced it into existence. And for the first time since I'd known him, he looked uncertain. Not angry. Not dismissive. Afraid. Because he understood something then. I wasn't there to argue. I was there to document. And documentation is how careers end. The room was larger than I expected, but quieter. Long tables formed a hollow square, polished to the point where reflections blurred into one another. Screens lined the walls, already glowing with charts no one was really looking at. The air carried that familiar mixture of authority and assumption, the belief that whatever happened here would stay contained. People took their seats with practiced ease. Expensive suits. Controlled expressions. Polite nods that meant nothing. I stood when it was my turn to speak. No one announced me. No title followed my name. Just a pause, and then silence, as curiosity replaced impatience. I didn't start with accusations. I started with numbers. Revenue streams that didn't match outputs. Consulting fees paid to entities with no employees. Risk assessments marked reviewed but never actually reviewed. Each point appeared on the screen behind me, sourced, dated, verified. I watched the room carefully, not for outrage, but for recognition. A few faces changed. One shareholder leaned forward. Another stopped taking notes. I continued. I showed how a single expansion project bypassed 3 levels of compliance. How environmental exposure had been knowingly underestimated. How projected penalties were delayed past executive tenures, time to fall on someone else's watch. This isn't mismanagement, I said calmly. It's forecasting liability and choosing not to be present when it arrives. Someone tried to interrupt. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply switched slides. Emails appeared. Internal memos. Language that could no longer be softened or reframed. Words written by people in this very room, now stripped of context and intention. That was when he spoke. He laughed lightly, as if amused. As if this were a misunderstanding that could be brushed aside with charm. This presentation lacks strategic perspective, he said. We make difficult decisions to protect long-term value. I looked at him then, really looked. And for the first time, I responded directly. Then let's talk about long-term value. I showed the final projections. The ones buried in archives. The ones marked confidential and quietly ignored. Facility shutdowns. Regulatory intervention. Personal liability. Not hypothetical. Modeled. Signed off. The room was no longer quiet. Questions started coming. Sharp, precise, impatient. Not at me, but at him. At the board. At each other. He tried to regain control, but authority doesn't survive evidence. It fractures. One shareholder asked for an immediate internal audit. Another demanded disclosure of personal holdings. Someone else requested a legal review of executive conduct. I stepped back. I didn't need to say anything more. The meeting adjourned abruptly. Not with resolution, but with urgency, the kind that signals damage control has failed. As people stood, conversations broke into fragments. No one laughed. No one lingered. He avoided my eyes as he passed. That afternoon, notices went out. An independent investigation. Temporary suspension of certain executive powers. Mandatory reporting to external regulators. Nothing official yet. But everyone understood. This wasn't about whether something had gone wrong. It was about how long it had been hidden. And who had helped hide it. I left the building without ceremony. No badge. No escort. Just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the narrative had shifted, and that once it shifts at this level, it never shifts back. The intern they mocked was gone. What remained was a record. And records don't forget. The fallout didn't explode. It crept. That was the first thing I noticed. Power doesn't fall with noise, it leaks away, one privilege at a time. Within days of the meeting, the building changed. Not structurally, but emotionally. People spoke in measured tones. Emails grew longer, more careful. Words like "as discussed" and "for the record" appeared everywhere. The investigation team arrived quietly. No announcements. No press. Just unfamiliar faces with badges that didn't carry company colors. They didn't start with executives. They started with records. Requests came in waves, financial logs, approval chains, archived correspondence. The same departments that once dismissed oversight were now scrambling to reconstruct decisions they'd never expected to defend. I was contacted on the third day. Not by the company. By the investigators. They asked for clarification on timelines, on intent, on how certain documents had been obtained. I answered precisely, never speculating, never exaggerating. Facts only. Evidence speaks best when it isn't dressed up. Meanwhile, the internal narrative began to fracture. Some executives claimed ignorance. Others blamed consultants. A few tried to rewrite history, suggesting the risks had been unforeseeable. Those versions didn't last long. Because the documents showed something else entirely. They showed planning. He issued his first public statement a week later. Carefully worded. Expressing full cooperation and confidence in the process. He thanked stakeholders for their trust. Trust, I noticed, was a word no one else used. Behind closed doors, pressure mounted. Shareholders demanded updates. Legal counsel insisted on distance. Board members who once defended him now avoided association. Isolation does strange things to people used to control. He reached out again. This time the message was shorter. We need to talk. I didn't respond. The second message came that night. You don't understand what you're doing. I understood perfectly. Because consequences had finally entered the room, and they don't negotiate. 2 days later, the board convened without him. Temporary leave was announced pending further review. Responsibilities redistributed. Authority diluted. A career built on decisiveness was suddenly subject to approval. That's how power ends, not with removal, but with irrelevance. The press caught wind soon after. Not details, just whispers. Words like irregularities and governance concerns. Analysts began asking questions on earnings calls that had no easy answers. Stock wavered. Confidence eroded. Inside the company, people started remembering things. Incidents they'd dismissed. Emails they'd archived. Conversations that felt different in hindsight. Memory is contagious once it's permitted. I watched from a distance as the narrative corrected itself. As praise turned into scrutiny. As silence became suspicion. And then came the final request. A formal interview. Under oath. I prepared carefully, not to accuse, but to recount. I walked them through the system as I'd seen it. How incentives aligned. How risk was deferred. How responsibility was intentionally blurred. When they asked about motive, I answered honestly. This wasn't about ambition, I said. It was about accountability. They didn't challenge that. By the end of the week, the outcome was inevitable. The board announced his resignation. Effective immediately. No farewell. No celebration of legacy. Just a brief notice, buried beneath operational updates. The market reacted calmly. Because the damage had already been priced in. I closed my laptop that evening and stepped outside. The city moved as it always had, indifferent, alive, unaware of how quietly power had shifted. He lost his career in a room full of people. I never raised my voice. I never revealed my name. I only showed the truth to the people who could no longer ignore it. After the resignation, there was a strange quiet. Not relief. Not celebration. Just a hollow pause, like the moment after a storm passes but before anyone steps outside to check the damage. For the first time since everything began, no one needed anything from me. The investigators wrapped up their interviews. The board issued statements filled with phrases like renewed commitment and restoring trust. Consultants were hired to redesign processes that should have existed all along. From a distance, it looked like closure. It wasn't. Winning didn't feel the way stories said it would. There was no rush, no triumph. Just exhaustion, layered with the uneasy knowledge that once you see how power really works, you can't unsee it. Friends asked why I didn't seem happy. I didn't know how to explain that bringing something rotten into the light doesn't make the smell disappear. It just makes everyone aware it was always there. Opportunities started appearing, carefully, indirectly. Messages from recruiters. Invitations to discuss fit. People who suddenly found my background interesting. I ignored most of them. Not because I was afraid, but because I was recalibrating. I needed to understand who I was without the pressure of being underestimated, without the constant calculation of risk. One evening, I received an envelope. No return address. No letterhead. Inside was a single sheet of paper. A copy of an internal memo, one I hadn't seen before. It outlined how my early access to records had been approved. Approved deliberately. By someone higher up. They had known what I could see. They had allowed it, assuming nothing would come of it. That I would learn, leave, forget. I sat with that for a long time. It meant this wasn't just a story about one executive falling. It was about a system that believed consequences could always be managed. I wasn't the exception. I was the variable they miscalculated. The realization changed something in me. It stripped away the last illusion I'd been carrying, that exposing one person meant fixing the problem. Systems don't break. They adapt. The only real question is whether the people inside them do. I started writing, not reports, not timelines, but reflections. What I'd seen. What I'd learned. How silence becomes policy. How mockery is often a warning sign, not of weakness, but of fear. I didn't publish anything. Not yet. Some stories need distance before they're told. Late one night, I passed the building again. Lights were still on. New names on doors. New leadership, promising new culture. The structure remained. I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. Power isn't loud. Justice isn't dramatic. And change rarely looks like victory when you're standing inside it. I walked away knowing something most people never learn. You don't need permission to hold the truth. You just need patience, and the courage to let it stand on record. Time did what confrontation never could. It clarified everything. Months passed, and the story continued to evolve without me needing to touch it. Investigations turned into reports. Reports turned into policy changes. Policy changes turned into quiet departures, people choosing to leave before their names were ever officially questioned. That was the real consequence. Not headlines. Not scandal. But erosion. The company survived, of course. Companies almost always do. They shed responsibility the way snakes shed skin, convincing the world they are renewed while carrying the same bones underneath. But individuals didn't survive so easily. I watched careers stall in subtle ways. Promotions delayed. Invitations withdrawn. Once influential voices reduced to carefully worded emails that no one rushed to answer. The system didn't punish loudly, it isolated. And isolation, for people who built their identity on relevance, was devastating. I stayed deliberately absent. No public commentary. No interviews. No posts claiming credit. Silence became my boundary. I'd learned that visibility invites distortion, and I didn't want my truth reshaped into someone else's narrative. Instead, I focused on rebuilding myself. For a long time, my sense of purpose had been reactive, responding to threat, navigating hostility, anticipating moves before they were made. When that pressure disappeared, it left a void that felt unsettling. I wasn't fighting anymore. So who was I without the fight? I took contract work that felt small compared to what I'd handled before. Reviewed documents. Consulted quietly. Helped organizations understand risk before it became catastrophe. I chose environments where listening mattered more than hierarchy. And something unexpected happened. People listened. Not because I demanded it. Not because I proved myself repeatedly. But because I spoke with the confidence of someone who had already tested truth against power, and watched power blink first. Occasionally, someone would recognize me. Not by name, but by story. A vague connection. A weren't you involved in? I never confirmed. Stories belong to whoever needs them most. I didn't need this one anymore. What stayed with me were the small moments I hadn't anticipated. A former junior employee reached out to thank me for making it possible to speak up later without being dismissed. An auditor told me my documentation style had changed how their team approached internal reviews. Someone else admitted they'd stopped laughing at interns altogether. Those moments mattered more than outcomes. Because they meant something had shifted, not everywhere, not completely, but enough to matter. There were still nights when doubt crept in. When I wondered whether the cost had been worth it. Whether the quiet suspicion that followed me into new rooms was permanent. People are wary of those who expose truth. They fear being next. I learned to live with that. What surprised me most was how little resentment I carried. I had expected anger to linger, to resurface when memories did. Instead, what I felt was distance. Emotional, intellectual, ethical distance. I had seen the machinery clearly. Once you understand how something works, it loses its power to intimidate you. One afternoon, while reviewing a governance proposal for a mid-sized firm, I noticed a familiar clause buried deep in the document. Language nearly identical to the one I'd once used to call a shareholder meeting. A safeguard. Ignored, until needed. I smiled to myself and suggested a revision that made it clearer, stronger, harder to quietly bypass. The board approved it unanimously. They never asked why it mattered so much to me. And I didn't explain. By the end of the year, the original company released its annual report. New leadership. New ethics committee. A section devoted entirely to transparency and accountability. His name appeared once. Buried in a footnote. Former executive. Tenure ended prior to the fiscal year. No justification. No defense. No legacy. I closed the document and felt something settle inside me. Finality. Not because justice is ever complete, but because the arc of the story had finished bending. What remained was its echo, the way it influenced decisions, behaviors, silences. I realized then that power isn't defeated when someone falls. It's defeated when others start behaving as if falling is possible. That's what had changed. I wasn't the center of the story anymore. And that was exactly how it should be. The last thing that changed wasn't external. It was me. For a long time after everything ended, I carried the experience like a sealed box, careful where I placed it, careful who I let near it. Not because I was ashamed, but because I understood how easily stories like mine get simplified. People want villains and heroes. They want clean lessons and dramatic justice. Real life doesn't work that way. What actually followed was quieter. Slower. A gradual recalibration of how I moved through the world. I stopped shrinking in rooms where decisions were being made. Not by speaking louder, but by refusing to doubt my own understanding. I stopped over-explaining, stopped cushioning facts to make them easier for others to accept. Truth didn't need my permission to exist, and it didn't need theatrics to be effective. Work became different after that. Not easier, just clearer. I found myself gravitating toward roles where systems mattered more than personalities. Where governance, ethics, and structure weren't buzzwords but foundations. I didn't chase prestige. Prestige had proven to be a fragile thing, easily traded for silence. Instead, I chose impact that didn't need applause. Sometimes I'd sit in meetings and recognize familiar dynamics starting to form, the quiet dismissal of someone junior, the subtle rewriting of responsibility, the early signs of risk being reframed as manageable. When that happened, I intervened early. Not dramatically. Not publicly. Just enough to shift direction. A question placed carefully. A document requested sooner than expected. A clause added that made future avoidance impossible. People often don't realize when they're being protected from their own worst instincts. That became my quiet work. There were moments, of course, when the past resurfaced unexpectedly. A news article about corporate misconduct. A whispered story passed around a conference table. A familiar look on someone's face when they realized I wasn't as harmless as they'd assumed. Those moments didn't sting anymore. They grounded me. Because I knew something then that I hadn't known before. I didn't win because I was clever. I didn't win because I was patient. I didn't even win because I was right. I won because the system they trusted had a flaw they'd ignored, and I chose to use it with integrity instead of fear. That distinction mattered. Late one evening, I received a message from someone at the company. Not a senior executive, not anyone famous. Just someone who had watched quietly from the sidelines. They wrote to say the culture really had changed. Not perfectly, not completely, but noticeably. People documented more. Asked better questions. Hesitated before dismissing concerns. You scared them, the message said. But in a good way. I stared at that line for a long time. Fear, I'd learned, wasn't always destructive. Sometimes it was instructional. Sometimes it reminded people that actions had weight, that shortcuts had consequences, that silence wasn't neutral. I replied with a single sentence. Good systems shouldn't rely on fear, just clarity. I never heard back. And I didn't need to. As years passed, the story lost its sharp edges. It became something told indirectly, reshaped by distance. The intern. The meeting. The resignation. Each retelling blurred details, softened motives, altered timelines. That was inevitable. What mattered was that the core truth remained intact. Someone underestimated had paid attention. Someone quiet had kept records. Someone without visible power had used the rules better than those who wrote them. That idea lingered. I saw it reflected in small things. A junior employee speaking up sooner. A policy written more carefully. A leader pausing before saying, "It doesn't matter." It always mattered. One afternoon, while reviewing governance documents for a new organization, I noticed something familiar again. The same clause, the same safeguard, the same quiet acknowledgement that no system is above accountability. This time, it wasn't buried. It was highlighted. I smiled, not because of pride, but because of recognition. Change rarely announces itself. It shows up in revisions, footnotes, and decisions no one claps for. That's where real power lives. I never returned to that building. I didn't need to. The place existed now as a reference point, not a destination. A reminder of who I became under pressure, and who I chose to be afterward. If there was a lesson in all of it, it wasn't about revenge or triumph. It was simpler. Pay attention. Document everything. Never assume silence means ignorance. And never mistake humility for lack of agency. Because sometimes the person you overlook isn't waiting for permission. They're waiting for the right moment. And when that moment comes, they won't raise their voice. They'll just put the truth on record. And let the system do the rest.